All right, so we are going to talk about spatial and temporal intensities and how to sort them in order from low to high and high to low. So when we look at intensities, we're talking about the measurement of the intensity of the beam, which we measure in milliwatts per centimeter squared. And we talk about it in terms of space, spatial, and in terms of time, temporal. So when we talk about space, we're talking about where physically in an ultrasound beam we are measuring the intensity. So a beam is going to have this hourglass shape because we focus our beam for ultrasound. So this is our transducer. And we're going to talk about where in this picture here are we actually measuring our intensity. So we can measure it at the most intense spot, which is actually right here at the focus, which is called the peak. Or we can measure the average of our beam. And the average of our beam would be taking kind of a cross section across, some section here, and averaging out all of the intensities. So out here, our beam is weak. In the middle, it's strong. And so when we average the spatial intensities, it's obviously going to be lower in intensity than our peak. So average is always going to be lower than peak when we're talking about intensities in terms of spatial intensity. When we're looking at temporal intensities, we can look at them on this graph of a wave. So we're going to use a pulsed wave because that's what we're normally using, which has that off time and then another pulse. And we also look at average and peak when we look at temporal intensities. So when we look at the peak temporal intensity, we're going to find the highest intensity that is occurring at some time during the beam, right? And so that's always going to be high, peak, high. When we look at average for temporal intensity, that's going to be the average from the start of a pulse all the way through to the start of the next pulse, which if you remember is our PRP. So temporal average is taken over the entirety of the PRP, which means it includes all these intensities that are happening during the pulse and then all the off time, which the intensity is obviously 0, right? So if you can think of that, right, our temporal average gets really, really low. It's like incredibly low because it has all this 0 intensity averaged in, which just makes it so low. So very low for average temporal intensity, or temporal average as we call it. Then there's also something that we measure in temporal intensities that's called pulse average. And the pulse average is the average of the intensities, but only during this on time, only when the pulse is actually happening, which if you remember is our pulse duration. So if we take the intensities here and we average them during just the on time, we get the pulse average. So the pulse average is always in the middle of the temporal average and the temporal peak, okay? It averages out, but only the on time. When we talk about these, we're going to talk about these in terms of abbreviations when we sort them. So spatial average, spatial peak, temporal average, temporal peak, and pulse average. And we combine a spatial average with a temporal average, and we sort these in order of intensities. So we can measure the spatial average, right, the average of the entire space of the beam here. We can measure that during the entirety of our temporal pulse here. Or we can measure this only at the same time as the temporal peak. Or we can measure this during the entirety of the pulse average. And same with spatial peak. So the combination of these measurements is what we wind up sorting. So we usually list the spatial averages first and then the temporal averages when we see these written out. But I like to think about these in terms of the temporal averages and then the spatial averages because the temporal intensities instead of the spatial intensities, because the temporal intensities actually kind of group together, and then the spatial intensities impact these a little bit less in terms of how the intensity changes. So the lowest will go low to high down here, okay? And so the lowest temporal intensity that we measure is temporal average. And then the middle we talked about was pulse average. And then the high is temporal peak. And then you can fill in spatial average and spatial peak because you already have these sorted in order for temporal. And then spatial average is always going to be lower than spatial peak. Spatial average, always lower than spatial peak. Spatial average, always lower than spatial peak. Move this over so you can see that that's a combo there. So it would go SATA, SPTA, SAPA, SPPA, SATP, SPTP. So if you look at this, spatial average, temporal average, right? Your combo of your two lowest measurements, and then spatial peak, temporal peak is your combo of your highest measurements. So that makes sense, and how they go up in intensity. If you were sorting these the other way, you'd start high and work your way down low. So if you were writing these out instead of using stickies, what I would do if you were going lowest to highest is I would start with, you're going to have your temporal averages low, your pulse average is mid, and your temporal peaks high, and then you fill them in. Spatial average, spatial peak, spatial average, spatial peak, spatial average, spatial peak. Now you have them lowest to highest. And if you need it to go the other way, highest to lowest, you would simply sort them the other way. Temporal peaks are going to be high, pulse averages are going to be middle, and temporal averages are going to be lowest. And then you fill them in. Highest is going to be spatial peak, then spatial average, spatial peak, spatial average, spatial peak, spatial average. And you have your highest to your lowest.